Chapter 31. Spear. John Hamman, 31. Cretaceous. Her stomach rumbled. She had eaten the last half of her protein bar, which had not been enough. The night was still dark, but Jenny could sense the dawn lightening the sky, even if she could not see it under the trees. She had cut ferns to make a bed, and more to cover her last night, but she still felt cold and stiff. She needed to find more food today, and she needed more of a weapon than the high power. Her remaining ammunition would go fast if she ran into another predator, but the real problem was that it had no real stopping power. She could probably empty the gun into some of the predators in this time, and it would still charge in and kill her long before it died. She would never hunt a lion or even a leopard with a 9mm. She needed something else. As soon as it was light enough to see, she began looking around the woods for a young sapling. She needed something small enough that it wouldn't be too heavy. She didn't like a heavy spear. Her leg hurt, and she took another of the antibiotics. She could see no sign of major infection, probably thanks to the modern medicines. Still, it slowed her down. It would take a while to heal, and she wouldn't be doing any running in the meantime. Mid-morning, she found something that might do. It was thin enough and straight enough that she wouldn't have to reshape it. It had enough length to give her a 6-foot shaft. She knelt down and started chopping at the base with the large Bowie knife. It was slower going than if she had a proper hatchet. Once she felled the sapling, she measured it against her own height and cut it off. While she had been working, she had been eyeing another tree. Would it be worth the effort? She was going to have to be a little sedentary for a while and could spare the time to work on it. The shape was actually pretty good. The tree was a conifer and too soft to do a truly proper job, but it would be better than nothing. She began to dig up the base of the tree and cut the roots. This took longer than Jenny had hoped, and she thought about giving up on the idea. She really wanted to find something to eat, and this wasn't getting her any closer. She decided to keep after it. Once the tree was down, she had to cut it off as well, more of a chore with this one, as it was thicker. She wished she had some type of saw. The exercise had not been completely fruitless. As she moved around the forest, she noticed at least 3 different species of conifer. She had colleagues who would give their eye teeth for the chance to see these early trees themselves. The cones of many of the trees were starting to open. She picked large samples of all 3 species. It was getting awkward to carry everything. Jenny found a spot away from any trail and started to gather wood for a small fire. The fire starter made short work of the tinder she gathered, and soon she had a small fire. She set the pine cones around it and sat down with her back to a tree to begin work on her projects. She stripped the bark from the shaft and started to smooth it. It didn't take much work to clean it up. She would be able to bind her grandfather's knife to it and have at least a functional spear. But before she did that, she needed it for her other project. This took quite a bit more whittling. First, she cleaned up the bottom, cutting away the roots and smoothing the round end. It was not a bad shape, about 4 inches around. The shaft was too thick. Holding the blade like a draw knife, she started to shave it down. It didn't take as long as she feared. Normally, one would use a tree with a much harder wood. She left it a bit thicker than usual, as it was a softer wood, and she did not trust it enough to make a thinner handle. As she worked, she kept turning the pine cones next to the fire, trying to warm them evenly. She wished she had a better way to heat them. Eventually, they opened up. Of the 3 species, 2 of them had nuts within the cone. It was the smallest cone that had the largest nuts. They were still smaller than the piñons from back home, at least on a good year. Perhaps it had been dry. She picked the nuts from them, keeping the 2 types separate. She looked at them hesitantly, Not all species were edible. Still, it was worth a try. She took the larger nut and smelled it. She wasn't sure what she expected. She rubbed it on the tip of her tongue and then put it down. She waited but did not feel any numbness or other symptoms. Finally, looking at it dubiously, she put it in her mouth and chewed. She held it in her mouth, moving it over her tongue, and then spit it out. Nothing frightening happened. It tasted like a nut. Fuck it. She peeled another and ate the thing. Waiting for some kind of pain, she went back to whittling. Her stomach hurt, but it was the same hunger she felt before. The other nut did not seem to produce any harmful effects either. She gave up on caution and ate all of them. It took a lot of peeling, and it was not nearly enough to satisfy her hunger. Teasing, it seemed to make her hunger worse. Jenny got up and gathered more pine cones. She soon had a whole ring of cones around the small fire and continued whittling. When she was done, she got the idea to heat the ball end and the point over the fire to harden them. She was not sure how much it helped, but it was worth a try. It worked on spear points. Soon, she had a functional knobkerry. It was a good height to serve her as a walking stick, something she would not object to right now. She turned the cones again, and then set about binding her grandfather's knife to the shaft with paracord. When she was done, she looked at her newest weapon. It was not a thing of beauty, but it looked dangerous. After, she turned to the waterhole, wanting something more substantial in her stomach. She did not approach the shore along one of the trails, but through the brush. She was as quiet as she could manage, not wanting to scare anything away, but more importantly, she was worried about hunters other than herself. She did not want to be the prey. It would be safer to hunt elsewhere, but she didn't have the time. It had been 2 days since her last real meal. She could not spot anything else watching the waterhole. It was still well before dark. It might be busier closer to sunset. She waited, and her waiting was rewarded. They weren't too big. That was good. She wanted something small. She couldn't afford to carry meat with her, and she had no good way to preserve it. They were on the far side of the waterhole. She didn't really want to use her gun. She didn't have much ammo left, but she needed the meat. She would have to try to make a better ranged weapon. She didn't see any practical way to build a bow. At least she hoped she would not be here long enough to have to do that. Jenny slowly reached down and drew the pistol from the holster on her belt. Slowly bringing it up in front of her where she lay on her belly under a fern, she propped herself on both elbows as she sighted on the dinosaurs. She picked one and waited for it to still. They were twitchy. They always seemed to be in motion. The bark of the 9mm was loud. She needed hearing protection. The rest of the herd moved so fast they seemed to vanish, leaving their companion behind. She worked her way around the waterhole toward it. It was some type of ornithischian. She could not place the species. It was about the size of a dog. She did a quick field dressing, leaving the awful well away from the waterhole to avoid contamination. Something would come along and clean up the pile of intestines for her. Before she carried her prize away, she had an idea. She gathered a good bundle of long-stemmed ferns from around the waterhole. With luck, they would be fibrous enough for her to weave them. Next, she picked up her kill and slung it across her shoulders. Holding one foreleg in the tail, she picked up her spear and made her way back to her little camp. The fire had died in her absence, but the pine cones had opened. It was not hard to reignite the fire. She built it up larger, since she would need more coals. When the fire burned down, she laid the reptile wrapped in leaves in the ashes and covered it in more ash, then pushed more coals on top of it. Her hope was that the ash would insulate the bundle, and the coals would provide the heat to slow cook the meat in its own skin. It was a good idea in theory. She had mixed luck in the past with this technique. One advantage was that it would not give off much of an odor, other than that of the fire. In the meantime, she looked at the ferns she gathered and started to strip them, splitting and pulling apart the long fibers. She might be able to work with this. As she worked, she munched on the pine nuts. Jenny eventually had a workable sling. It was crude, and she wasn't sure how pliable it would stay as the fibers dried. It would probably not last long, but she could always make another. She kept the fire going and kept pushing new coals on top of her meal. It was starting to get dark by the time her dinner was ready to eat. It was burnt, or part of it was, but it left more than enough to eat. She stuffed herself with as much as she could, then gathered up her new weapons and moved off into the night. She wanted to sleep somewhere else, away from the place she had cooked. She washed her hands in the dirt, trying to get rid of the smell of the greasy meat. Thoughts kept coming about the theropods that had pursued her. She found a new place to curl up for the night, not wanting to sleep in the same location twice.